Between 1988 through to 1990, a notorious American serial killer murdered 11 women in upstate New York. The media dubbed him with various nicknames such as the Rochester Strangler, the Monster of the Rivers, and the Genesee River Killer. His real name was Arthur Shawcross. The nicknames attributed to him describe how he carried out his murders and where he dumped the victims. When he was finally captured, he made a series of outrageous claims to criminal experts and psychiatrists, which provided an insight into the way his mind worked, while at the same time, it certainly divided opinion. Hi my friend, I'm Royston, and welcome back to Tea and Crime. To get a better understanding of who this killer was, we need to peer into his disturbing background. Now joining us today to help us do that is a fellow true crime creator known as That Crime Guy, as this is a collaboration video. So if you guys are okay to stick around, let's do a deep dive into this case. Arthur Shawcross was born on the 6th of June 1945 in Kittery, Maine, remaining there for a short while before the family relocated to a place almost 400 miles away known as Watertown near Lake Ontario in New York while he was still a child. He was socially challenged and spent a lot of time alone while growing up in Watertown. His withdrawn behaviour provided other youngsters with an excuse to use the nickname Oddie with reference to him, as he seemed like the odd one out. His behaviour at school caused concern, as he would often skip classes which didn't help prepare him for the future. And when he did make the effort to be there, he'd misbehave. He tried to instill fear in others by picking fights with his fellow students. The outcome of these actions meant he would fail academically at school, clearly displaying behavioural issues that didn't help him achieve anything worthwhile. In fact, he dropped out of school at around the age of 15, and over the next few years his violent tendencies intensified as he became inclined toward arson and burglary, eventually being placed on probation in 1963 for breaking a store window. Shawcross was like a ticking time bomb, because at an early age he displayed what criminologists call the McDonald Triad. The triad links cruelty to animals, obsession with fire setting, and persistent bedwetting past a certain age to violent, homicidal or sexual predatory behaviour. Arthur tortured animals, set fires, and wet the bed regularly. He was drafted into the military in late 1967, spending a year in Vietnam. He divorced his first wife around that time, giving up parental rights to his little boy, who he never saw again. Years later, he claimed to have killed more than 40 Vietnamese, describing the torture he inflicted in graphic detail. After his release from the army, he returned to New York with his second wife, to a place called Clayton, which was a half-hour drive from Watertown. However, she divorced him shortly afterward due to his intolerable behaviour toward her. Arthur was then sentenced to 5 years in prison for something found on that McDonald Triad, arson, in 1969. But as is often the case, he didn't serve the full term. He was released in October 1971 after just 22 months. And at this point he returned to his boyhood area, moving back to Watertown. And by the following spring he was married for a third time by the age of 27. His wife Penny was a girl he'd known in high school. She was pregnant with his child, but sadly miscarried a few months later. And like his previous marriages, it was short-lived, ending directly after a shocking confession that he murdered 2 local children. In May 1972, Shawcross was seen walking around with one of his neighbours, a young lad named Jack Blake. They knew each other relatively well, because Arthur took him fishing on several occasions in their local community. Jack had blonde hair, freckles, big ears, and a pug nose. He was a typical fun-loving 5th grader, while being the 7th of 9 children. Amazingly, he once saved his older sister from drowning in the Black River. Arthur was the last person seen with young Jack, after which the boy disappeared, never to be seen alive again. And not long after he went missing, Shawcross was observed eating ice cream on the bridge, where they often fished together. Then, on the 2nd of September, just 4 months after Blake's murder, Shawcross violently killed an 8-year-old named Karen Hill, who was in Watertown with her mother.
Karen's body was found under a bridge crossing the Black River. After the young girl was reported missing, her mother questioned Shawcross repeatedly because she knew her daughter talked to him and was seen in his company, but he didn't really respond to her. Arthur was known to fish quite frequently off the bridge where Karen's body was found, and police felt it would be a good idea to bring him in for questioning. After the interrogation, he made a vague confession to her murder. Under a plea deal due to the police lacking concrete evidence to link Shawcross to the murder, he agreed to provide information that would lead to the discovery of Jack Blake's body. By the time they found him, he was in an advanced stage of decomposition, and it was therefore made difficult to determine whether he'd been sexually assaulted or not. Shawcross later pleaded guilty to killing Hill on a charge of manslaughter. He sexually manhandled the 8-year-old girl, stuffing her mouth with mud and leaves to keep her quiet. He then strangled the poor child. While the murder charges concerning Blake, the 10-year-old boy, were dropped, he was found guilty of the charges against him relating to the girl and sentenced to 25 years in prison as a result. When released, he had trouble finding somewhere to live. Short stays were experienced in various places in New York, such as Binghamton, Delhi, and Fleischmann's. However, once those communities learned of his past via notifications by the authorities, it created deep concerns that a child killer was in their midst. Therefore, Shawcross had no choice but to flee from those locations. In the end, his parole officer moved him and his latest girlfriend, who in time became his 4th wife, Rose Wally, to the Cadillac Hotel in Rochester, New York, where they stayed until finding a more suitable, permanent place at 241 Alexander Street in Rochester towards the end of 1987. In an effort to avoid the previous issues, his parole officer didn't notify local law enforcement that a convicted child killer was living in their community, meaning his files were essentially sealed. They were just glad to get him as far away from where he killed those kids. Now here's the thing. Well within a year of moving to Rochester, this man found it hard to contain his appetite for murder. It appeared that his thirst for violence could no longer be kept under control. Rochester, in New York State, forms the core of a much larger metropolitan area with a population of around 1 million people across 6 counties. It's close to the Canadian border and set amongst the gorges and falls of the Genesee River. It's a middle-class city, but sadly has a dark side. Lyell Avenue is about a mile long, which continues through one of the city's run-down neighbourhoods, where you'll find its seedy red light district. In March 1988, women began disappearing from this area. Dorothy Blackburn was a 27-year-old woman whose body was found on the 24th of March 1988, bearing deep bite marks around her genitals at Salmon Creek, northwest of Rochester. She was a prostitute and drug addict who specialised in oral sex, mistakenly believing that it would keep her safe from AIDS. It was determined that she had been strangled. He would later complain that she'd bitten his penis and called him a faggot, which I guess in his mind merited the death penalty. In July, Anne Stephan, a 27-year-old woman, went missing. Her decomposed body was found on the banks of the Genesee River. He also killed 59-year-old Dorothy Keeler, also in July 1989. He knew Dorothy, and they'd spent the day together involved in some kind of romantic relationship. They argued about some money stolen from him, and Dorothy threatened to tell his wife and mistress about their affair Yes, he had a mistress as well. And that was the last threat she ever made, as he snapped her neck. He later returned to the body, removed the head, and threw it in the river. Her death was due to some stolen cash and a threat she made toward him. He started to kill more frequently between September to December 1989. After the fourth murder, police began to realise that they could potentially be dealing with a serial killer in Rochester. They had the bodies of 4 women, all who went missing and were murdered within 7 months of each other. 3 had been murdered within a few weeks of each other, and 3 of those victims were prostitutes from Lyell Avenue, and all the victims had bite marks and had been strangled to death. Investigators went from looking for individual killers to looking for a serial killer, and the window of time between his kills was only getting shorter. The media also developed a keen interest in the murders and dubbed the killer as the Genesee River Killer, the Rochester Strangler, or the Monster of the Rivers. By now, Rochester was living in fear. Prostitutes were aware someone was targeting them. Parents were telling their teenagers to always have their buddies with them to be safer in numbers. The media was screaming from the rooftops that someone with bad intentions was demonstrating his hate, and the city was demanding answers. One of the victims was June Stotts, a 30-year-old woman with mild learning disabilities. She disappeared in October 1989, and her body was found in November. June was a friend of Arthur and Rose, his wife, and a regular visitor to their home. Shawcross had seen June sitting near the river on a warm day, and she accepted an offer to spend some time with him. He drove her to a local beach, where they played on the sand, fed the ducks, then engaged in some man and woman adult activities. However, after having fun together, Arthur ended her life. He didn't seem satisfied just strangling June, who was meant to be a friend. For some reason, he decided to cut this lady open from her throat right down to her groin with a knife, and claimed, when he was eventually caught, to have removed part of her body to eat it. After this atrocity, he reverted to living his life as though nothing had happened. He went on to commit around another 4 murders after this, and the police were now even more perplexed. Stott wasn't a drug addict or prostitute, and her body had been left in an area different from the other victims. Could it be that Rochester was being stalked by 2 serial killers, they thought? It seemed like a new woman went missing every week, and those that were found murdered were far from being solved.
It was at this point the Rochester police realised it was time to contact the FBI for help. One of the prostitutes he snuffed out was Kimberly Logan, who was 30, another Lyell Avenue worker. She was found dead on the 15th of November 1989. The young woman had been brutally kicked and beaten, with dirt and leaves crammed down her throat, in a similar way to what Shawcross did to 8-year-old Karen Hill back in 1972. This one piece of evidence could have led the authorities straight to Arthur's front door, but it didn't, because if you remember, his files had been sealed. And this meant the authorities had no idea Shawcross was even living in Rochester. It makes you wonder how that parole board felt when all of his crimes came to light. The FBI agent sent to Rochester created a profile of the serial killer. They identified the killer showed characteristics of a man in his 30s. Shawcross was in his 40s. The killer was established as being white, who knew his victims. And that's interesting because Arthur had a habit of picking prostitutes up, and in time, they came to know him. Once he was finished with these women, he returned them back to their spot safely, even though most of them were creeped out by him. However, it appears as though the women he used regularly had built up some kind of trust with Shawcross, giving them a false sense of security while in his company. It's almost as if he was preparing these ladies for their eventual deaths. So yes, he knew his victims. The FBI also mentioned he was probably a local man, familiar with the area, and more than likely had a criminal record, which turned out to be accurate. Based on the lack of semen found on his victims, it was determined he was sexually dysfunctional, finding his gratification after his victims were dead. They additionally believed the killer would return to mutilate the bodies whenever possible. With this in mind, the agent strongly suggested that when the next body was found, investigators should wait and watch to see if the killer returns. A number of women would go missing in the cold month of December. In an effort to find the missing women, police organised an air search of the Genesee River Gorge, as that's where the vast majority of victims were being dumped. Road patrols were also sent out. Then, on the 2nd of January 1990, another air and ground search was organised, and right before calling it off due to bad weather, the air team spotted what appeared to be the body of a half-naked female lying face down near Salmon Creek. And as they went down to get a closer look, a man was noticed standing on the bridge above the body. He appeared to be urinating or possibly even masturbating. But when he spotted the helicopter, he immediately fled the scene in his car. The ground team were alerted and pursued him. The body, which was surrounded by fresh footprints in the snow, was that of June Cicero, who Arthur had murdered just a couple of days earlier, and couldn't stop himself returning to the crime scene, as indicated by the FBI. June too had been strangled to death. Alarmingly, bite marks covered her mutilated body. The police soon caught up with Shawcross to question him. When he was asked for his driver's license, he told the police he didn't have one because he'd been convicted for manslaughter. Plus, the car belonged to his girlfriend. Therefore, Shawcross and his girlfriend, Clara Neal, were brought into the police station for interrogation. And after many hours of this, Arthur maintained he had nothing to do with the Rochester murders. However, in time, with all of the pressure the police hauled his way, he eventually confessed to murdering those 11 women, most of whom were prostitutes. And once he was officially arrested awaiting trial, his mental state was examined by professionals. At this point, he talked about his childhood and made sinister allegations about his family, claiming his mother and aunt sexually abused him when he was a boy. He also talked about frequently engaging in incest with his sisters. His defence team argued he suffered with brain damage, mental illness and trauma during his childhood. In contrast to these claims, his parents and siblings maintained he had a normal childhood, suggesting the described events were largely the product of his imagination. There's no way of knowing whose version represents the reality of his upbringing, but what became clear in time was Shawcross would change his stories almost at will when interviewed by various professionals in the course of their investigation.
A common trait of serial killers is the desire to show that they're still in control and can reach through the prison bars and still do damage to those outside. When it comes to Arthur Shawcross, this certainly appears to be the case, because throughout the years when interviewed, his answers to questions seemed to change depending on who was doing the interviewing. Female interviewers were often subjected to his long descriptions of how much he enjoyed eating the body parts and organs that he had cut out from his victims. Male interviewers often had to listen to his fabricated conquests in Vietnam while he served there for a year. If he thought he sensed sympathy from the interviewer, he'd add more details about how his mother would insert sticks into his anus, or how he would explain how his aunt exploited him as a child. The guy was transparent, so much so that the interviewers, detectives and doctors that listened to him doubted much of what he said, particularly when it came to describing his unpleasant childhood, or his enjoyment of cutting up women and eating their body parts. Now don't get me wrong, some professionals did believe what he had told them. His case caused great division between a number of experts who were looking into it at the time. When speaking to psychiatrists about his time in Vietnam, he made claims about going out on secret missions. This involved beheading 2 Vietnamese women, nailing their heads to trees to serve as a warning to the enemy, then eating parts of their bodies, and killing 39 other enemy troops. He also spoke about burning huts down, going on patrols in the jungle, and other stuff like that. However, 2 psychiatrists who interviewed him agreed that Shawcross changed the story so often that it became totally unbelievable. I guess what this does show is the way his mind worked. It tended to conjure up all kinds of evil acts. Even though it was verified that he had spent a year in Vietnam, his role was nothing like he explained it to be. The army would provide proof that Shawcross was never stationed near a jungle, never fought in combat, never burned huts down, and never went on jungle patrols as he claimed. It turned out that his role in Vietnam was to hand out uniforms to other soldiers. These are some of the activities he claimed happened to him for one reason or another. It's a lot to try to digest. However, the bottom line is this. An overwhelming amount of evidence pointed to the fact that Shawcross tried to camouflage the murders he committed in Rochester. He knew exactly what he was doing and found meaningful, profound enjoyment in killing people while making every effort to hide the bodies from being discovered. He often returned to the crime scenes to satisfy his depraved sexual urges. Even though he tried his best to come across as someone who wasn't quite right in the head, he was ultimately found to be sane and sentenced to 250 years in prison. Arthur Shawcross died on the 10th of November 2008, aged 63, while serving his life sentence for the murders of those 11 women. I have a feeling deep down in my gut that this man won't be missed.
That evaluation is spot on. I'd like to thank that crime guy for sharing his time with us working on the script and helping put all of this together concerning the depraved activities of such an evil man. There's a link to his channel in the description box that I'd encourage you to go and check out if you've not done that already. You won't be disappointed, trust me. And we'd love to hear your views about this particular case down in the comments. 2 more videos are now on the screen, with one of them from that crime guy, and I'm sure you know what to do. Well, I'm Royston, and I'll see you next Sunday.